Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar update on the census during COVID-19. My name is Kate Warren. I'm a research associate with the Center for Community Solutions, and we have been hosting these weekly Friday webinars along with our partners at Advocates for Ohio's Future since March, and we are thrilled that you are all here with us to hear these updates about the census, which is one of the most important things to happen in this decade. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce Kelsey Bergfeld at Advocates for Ohio's Future.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. And again, thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. We are really excited that you're here to learn about the census. We know that our current pandemic has changed a lot of advocacy and a lot of the timelines associated with the census. So I know I'm looking forward to learning kind of what the outlook looks like, what the response rates are for our state, and what we can do to make sure that our friends and neighbors are counted. So once again, my name is Kelsey Bergfeld, and I'm the Coalition Manager for Advocates for Ohio's Future. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan coalition of about 500 statewide and local organizations involved in health and human services, policy, research, and advocacy. So very quickly, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We are pleased to be joined by Tracy Nahara with the Children's Defense Fund Ohio, also a member of leadership of Advocates for Ohio's Future. We are also joined by Kate Warren, again, with Center for Community Solutions, Aaron Davies with the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition, and Devontae Dickey with Cleveland Votes. So Tracy, whenever you're ready, please feel free to start us off.
Wonderful, and thank you so much. I just want to take a moment and thank Center for Community Solutions and Advocates for Ohio's Future for hosting these webinars on these very important topics. You know, at this moment in time where we are working remotely, we're working, away from each other, this is a great venue to bring us all together and to keep active and to keep informed on issues affecting our state. So I just want to start off by sharing a little bit about Children's Defense Fund and also Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition. So the Children's Defense Fund, we're a child advocacy, public policy, data and research organization that's been operating here in Ohio for nearly 40 years. We focus on advocating for Ohio's most vulnerable children, especially children of color, children who are poor, children who are on the fringes, right? Them and their families and their communities. They are not seen, they are not heard. And we fill the gap in terms of making sure that their voices are lifted up and that their concerns are brought to the forefront in public policy. So how does this all connect with census? So I'm just going to take a moment just to share with you a little bit about, why and how we got involved with the census. So about 18 months ago, 24 months ago, somewhere in that range, many of our partners around the country started talking about the 2020 census and its importance. And of course, at that point I was like, well, the census, I barely remember the 2010 census. And, I think it took a little bit of education on my part, to learn more about why it's so significant and what the connection is with child advocacy. So two major data points that really started shifting my thinking was, number one, children under the age of 5 were the most missed population in the 2010 census, not only here in Ohio, but nationally. Number two, every individual missed in the census represents, depending on which study you're looking at, what methodology, represents basically a loss in federal funds for that state, for that community, of between $1,200 and $1,700. So those two data points really convinced, I think not only me, but many of my colleagues that, wow, this is something that we really need to be paying attention to for a variety of reasons. Now, the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition, they represent organizations around the state that, have a similar perspective and viewpoint in terms of the importance of the census and in terms of making sure that all Ohioans are counted. So we've all come together, with this perspective, with this motivation, and that's kind of the impetus for our work. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll just do a quick Census 101 and talk a little bit more about children. So what is the census? And at this point, I expect everyone on this webinar to know exactly what it is. It's been in the news so much. I often joke that, I'm the biggest fangirl of Hansi-Lo Wang from NPR, because that's all he does is reporting on the census. And I just read all his reports religiously. But basically, it's a nationwide head count of every person living in this country, regardless of citizenship. It's constitutionally required every 10 years. And under normal circumstances, it would be conducted between March and July. However, we are not living in normal circumstances. Therefore, there has been some adjustments with census operations that I'm sure one of my colleagues will go into a little bit more. So why don't we go to the next slide as well? So I talked a little bit about the timeline and how it's been, adjusted. So census operations, field operations, were basically pushed back because of the public health emergency. And I think rightfully so, because of, the focus on protecting those census workers and protecting the general public. So it has been pushed back, somewhat significantly. However, those operations have been resumed in recent weeks. If we can go to the next slide. So a couple things that I really want to make sure that we all recognize, especially right now, is why the census is important to Ohio. Really why it's important to every state. So number one is funding. For the state of Ohio, and I'm sure that many of you have heard this before, but it doesn't hurt to say it again, $33.5 billion in federal funds flow to the state of Ohio based on our census data. In terms of representation, especially right now, Ohio's local, state, and federal boundaries for representation are drawn using census data. So when we start talking about redistricting and other issues similar to that, which one of my colleagues will, the census data is critical. It's integral to making sure that we have fair representation, at least the foundational data for that. In terms of decision making at every level of government and also our private sector community as well, census data, again, is significantly important. Everything from, planning for new schools to, where housing should be or new business starts should look, or where they should be sited. So all of those things are really drawn from that census information. And then lastly, but I think in my opinion, most importantly, it's about being seen and it's about being heard. And it's really about, no pun intended, but it's about being counted in our society, in our community. So when you think about, who are the individuals who are not counted or who, whose voices aren't included, right? We need to reverse that. We need to flip that. We need to make sure that everyone is seen, everyone is counted, and everyone's voices count, especially in a strong democracy, in a strong community. So for many reasons, that's why the census is important. And I know that some of my colleagues, and me included, we have been, questioning and voicing our support for, including getting more information about LGBTQ plus populations and making sure that that's part of future census, because that's included in terms of, who is counted, who is seen, who is heard. So there's many communities that we need to make sure are part of this. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So again, just going back to the funding aspect of the census, one of the things that I find really interesting is when we start breaking down the federal funds that actually flow to Ohio based on an accurate count, it's not these, kind of nebulous programs that would never touch us, right? It's all these things that impact our life every day. So in Ohio, half of every baby born in this state, that birth is covered through Medicaid. So Medicaid, CHIP, they touch a significant portion of our population. anyone who has a car and drives anywhere, of course, highway and transportation funding, that touches your life. Ohio has, a pretty high rate of, foster care placements depending on where you are in the state. And we want to make sure that we have a strong child welfare system that supports families, that supports children. So again, really, really important. And of course, business loans. We've heard a lot about this over the last several months with PPP, but we want to make sure that we have an equitable economic development environment here in Ohio, and that small business loans are available to everyone. But, the first step is just making sure we have small business loans allocated to our state. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of democracy and representation, Ohio is poised to lose 1 to 2 seats, or seats in Congress. And making sure that we have an accurate count will obviously support making sure that we get the representation, that not only that we need, but, get our fair share in DC. We go to the next slide. Now, of course, there's a lot of myths around the 2020 census, and I'm sure that many of you who have been following the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition on social media, or many of our partners, we've attempted to address some of these. I think the biggest myth out there right now is that there's a citizenship question, or only citizenship, or only people who are citizens should be filling out the census. And I feel like, we need to say this over and over again. Citizenship, is not a requirement to fill out the census, because the census is really a marker for who all is living here, because it really is about resources and infrastructure. We can go to the next one, please. And now a little bit about Ohio's hard to count population. So here's a couple pieces of visuals that we have here, to really emphasize, or to give you examples of the types of communications that we're trying to put out there to reach communities who have felt like either they're not safe filling out the census, or this isn't really a priority, and trying to break through some of those myths and perceptions, and making sure that people understand that number one, they're safe filling out the census, and that their voice is absolutely needed. So we have a couple here, one of them from Census Counts 2020, another one trying to really tie census to strengthening democracy, because it is part of a strong democracy. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then, just to give you a little bit of an idea of where our hard to count populations are, here's just a map of Ohio, and where you see, some color here, some dark colors, that's where our hard to count populations are within the state, especially where, you have children under the age of 5, where you might have, high concentrations of ethnic minority populations, or, other populations that have been traditionally hard to reach, like college students. So you can see Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, some rural areas of our state. Those have been areas that we've really been trying to focus on over the past, over a year now, through the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition, and through this network of advocates. And I want to say that, it's 30 statewide organizations, and it's another over probably 50 to 60 smaller community-based organizations that are really trying to use their experience in community and the trust that they've built over time in community to really make inroads and making sure that these hard to count, communities, individuals, that they know that they are, part of the census, that their voices need to be heard, and they should complete this for them and their families. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here I have a couple slides, and I'm running short on time here, but a couple slides about why counting Ohio's children is critical to this effort. So I talked a little bit about, how children under the age of 5 were the hardest, or were the most missed populations. And just to break that down for you, about 70% of children in the Cleveland area live in hard to count areas of the city, 70%. So that's a pretty significant number. When we look at Columbus, that's about half of the children in Columbus are living in hard to count areas of the city. So it makes it, you know, that much more important and critical for us to make sure that we're reaching parents, that we're reaching those service providers and those trusted community voices to making sure those kids are being counted. We can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit more information, and also we have Cincinnati and Toledo's data here as well. You can go to the next slide. And also just a couple other items, you know, beyond children under the age of 5, you know, especially right now during times of pandemic, we think that college students who have gone home early, right, for spring semester, that they are at risk of not being counted, and also children living in split households. Maybe there's joint custody arrangements, but, you know, in times of quarantine, that can be very tricky. Also, before and after COVID-19, children in the foster care system. So we have some fact sheets and we have some materials on our website, as does the Census Bureau, that can walk you through, you know, some guidance as to how they can be counted. Next slide, please. A couple things also I want to emphasize is how the census is very easy to fill out. It takes less than 10 minutes. You can do it a variety of ways: phone, paper, mail, etc. And we can go to the next slide. And then also on CDF's website and on the OCAC website, we have toolkits for service providers and for parents and for community members who want to be a partner with us in making sure that our children are being counted around the state. Everything from talking points to FAQs to things that you can post on digital media. Next slide. And of course, we have fact sheets that you can download. And I think that's pretty much it for me. Again, lots of materials for communications that are available, and you know, hard to count communities. So please check out those materials and make sure that our children are counted. And I'm going to pass it off to our next panelist. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. A lot of what Tracy just covered really helps lay the groundwork for why the census is so important for our communities around the state. And I think the challenges that we now face during this pandemic. I do just want to let you know that several of my colleagues and I have been tracking census updates and writing about the importance of census data on our website. And so if you're looking for more information, in addition to checking out those great resources from OCAC, I recommend going to that short link on this slide, comsols.com/census2020 for information and updates. That's a great source for you. You can go to the next slide. So Tracy touched on this briefly. I'm going to go into a little more detail. The pandemic has, of course, been really challenging for the whole nation in a variety of ways, but I would argue that the pandemic could not have hit at a worse time for the US Census. Cases started really ramping up, and the shutdown happened right at the very time that census invitations were going out in the mail. And the reality is that according to the original timeline, we should have already been wrapping up census field operations within the next couple of weeks. And so instead, because of delays caused by the pandemic, we still have a long way to go in making sure that every person in Ohio is counted in the census. The non-responsive follow-up portion of the census, this is where Census Bureau staff visit households that have not yet self-responded to the census, is now set to begin on July 30th. And the Bureau is planning to do a soft launch in different communities around the country. And there are still so many uncertainties about going door to door, doing it safely. How will people respond to a census taker that shows up at their door? And these are very legitimate concerns about safety and trust that the Census Bureau has to really grapple with now. So although they initially said that the census takers would only wear masks if the local jurisdiction required it, they have now said that all door knockers will be required to wear masks. So I think that's a really important piece of this, and helps ensure the safety of people living in our communities who will be visited by these census takers. Additionally, they will have access to hand sanitizer. The Bureau has acquired 48,000 gallons of hand sanitizer for offices and 3.6 million bottles, small bottles of hand sanitizer for field staff. So that's some fun trivia for you, but they will be stocked with hand sanitizer. One Ohio community, Mansfield, is on the list for this soft launch portion of the non-responsive follow-up. So folks in Mansfield can expect to get visits from census takers starting in just a few weeks. And in addition to going door to door, the non-responsive follow-up portion of the outreach includes these mobile questionnaire assistance locations in public places in the lowest responding areas of the nation. I don't believe we have a detailed list yet of where those areas will be, but the Census Bureau will set up these mobile questionnaire assistance locations at grocery stores, food banks, laundromats, restaurants, unemployment offices, places of worship, and libraries. All of those are examples, just public places where people may be. They're hoping to reach them. And they'll have sort of tablets that they can help people complete the census on site at those locations. So the extended deadline, the new deadline for having a complete census count is October 31st. That means that we are more than halfway through the time period where the Census Bureau is counting individuals and households, but really now is crunch time. The people who have not self-responded yet, despite the fact that multiple mailings and invitations have gone out, will be the hardest to reach and the hardest to count. And the barriers are greater than in years past because of this pandemic. There's just so much uncertainty. So now after the October 31st deadline, the Bureau needs time to tabulate the responses and report them back to the public. And Congress has not yet approved these delayed count delivery deadlines, but the Bureau seems optimistic that they will. So if everything goes according to this plan, all the states will receive redistricting data by the end of July 2021. But just so you all are aware, this creates some challenges on the back end as well, because in Ohio, our state legislative districts need to be drawn by September 1st, and the congressional districts are due by September 30th. So that means we only have 1 month once we receive that redistricting data to draw our state districts, and 2 months for those federal districts. So there is definitely a crunch in taking those numbers and making sure that we have fair districts. And we know that redistricting is not something that we want to give short shrift to. We really want to get that right. And with the extended census timelines, that just means that the redistricting timelines are more compressed. You can go to the next slide. So how is Ohio doing right now in its census response rates? Ohio is faring better than the national average in census response rates, but 1 in 3 Ohio households, or around 3.9 million Ohioans, have yet to be counted in the US Census. So looking at what this means around the state, in some of our largest urban counties, response rates for the whole county are hovering right around 63%. The rates are worse in the central cities, which I'll show in a moment. But if you click, you can see that we are also seeing lower response rates in counties throughout Appalachia. So counties like Harrison, Morgan, and Benton County have response rates in the low to mid 50s. If you click, the lowest response rate in the county in the state is Ottawa County with 47.5% responding. And the highest response rate county is Medina with 79% responding. So you can see there's a lot of variety around the state in response rates. You can go to the next slide. So this map shows the census response rates in cities around the state. And just to note, the Census Bureau has this interactive response rate map for the whole country, and it's updated every day with new data. I pulled this data on Wednesday. The link is there at the bottom of this slide. You can visit it and interact with the data yourself. I'm just sort of going over some highlights. In the 10 largest cities in Ohio, Cleveland has the lowest response rate currently. And actually, of the largest cities in the country, Cleveland has the lowest response rate with a 47% self-response rate. And if you look at the rest of the 10 largest cities, Dayton is the only other one with a response rate below 50%. So these are some really concerning numbers coming out of some of our cities in Ohio. I do want to note that there are lots of smaller cities also with low response rates. These are just the 10 largest cities in the state. You can go to the next slide. So if we zoom in even more on the cities of Cleveland and Dayton, which are our lowest response rate large cities, you can see that in many census tracts, response rates are still below 30%. So these are the types of areas where we may expect to see targeted outreach from the Census Bureau, and also where community groups are targeting their efforts, which Aaron and Devontae are both going to talk about what those things have looked like on the ground. So that's sort of an overview of how we're doing in Ohio and the timeline. And I'm going to pass it over to our next presenter, which is Aaron Davies with the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition. Aaron.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Appreciate it. So I'm here to talk about the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition, or OCAC. So the OCAC is, you can see, a nonpartisan network of statewide nonprofit organizations and advocacy folks that includes faith, business, education, and community leaders. So it's really a coalition at the statewide level to focus on how we're doing with the census. And our purpose is really, as Tracy said at the beginning, to encourage full participation in the 2020 census, particularly for hard to count communities. Next slide. So I want to start by talking about funding in our budget. So OCAC has received some funding for Get Out the Count efforts. Other states have invested, honestly, millions of dollars in their census efforts, and mostly around, making sure that all their folks are counted, so that they have, are represented at the federal level according to their fair share of the population. However, Ohio state budget had a line item of exactly $0 for the census. The Development Services Agency did say they were going to move around funds to make some funds available for the census, but there really has not been a state investment in the census here in Ohio. We, through the OCAC, projected a minimum of $1.7 million in need to reach all of those low-income, hard-to-count communities that Kate was mentioning and showing on the map. But Ohio's philanthropic community did step forward and provide some targeted investments to reach the areas of highest need in the state. And that includes field work in Cuyahoga, Franklin, and Hamilton County, as well as some digital outreach in some other counties. Go next slide. So how we are arranged is there's an executive team of several organizations throughout the state, and that team is divided into essentially two working groups: local outreach and policy advocacy. So we did actually, as OCAC, advocate in the state budget for funding for the census, unfortunately unsuccessfully. So how our local outreach is structured is one person from our executive team works with each of the regional leads. So we have the Central, Northeast, and Southwest regional leads. So Franklin, Cuyahoga, and Hamilton County. And you can see the organization there. And then we have regional partners in each of those regions who are really in touch with their local communities and hard to count communities, and know how best to reach and message to those communities. Next slide, please. So, like I said here, we have the local outreach working group. Our co-chairs are leading the regional outreach. And then the regional co-lead really is coordinating the census efforts in that region and developing kind of the overall plan. And then there's the coalition of partner organizations who are more deeply connected at the grassroots level. Next slide. And so we're targeting particular hard to count communities, and you can see on this slide which communities we're targeting. So There's some overlap between the counties, but there's also unique things about each county. So for example, Cuyahoga has a larger population of Asian American and Pacific Islander folks. And so we're really targeting in Cuyahoga County on that population, and have unique organizations who are embedded in those communities doing that outreach. Next slide, please. So what was supposed to happen, our blessed laid plans, were that our three major strategies with this outreach would be public education events, canvassing, and get out the count events. So those would be events where folks could come and fill out the census and learn more. The unfortunate thing was that all of these were going to be in person. And we were about to start in March 2020. And then the world happened. And so if you can go to the next slide, we had to adjust really quickly on the fly, and our partners were amazing in doing this. And so on this slide, I think we really are an example of how partners switched from mostly in person to mostly online, literally overnight. And I think without the census extension to October 31st, I mean, we would be ending the census in 2 weeks, which would have been a major pressure point. So this is really kind of the order that of how folks shifted and kind of what folks shifted to. And so really folks moved pretty quickly to printed materials and putting those materials in, food bags for folks, putting them in high trafficked areas. Also going to social media ads, so paying to promote social media ads, increasing PPE, so hand sanitizer, masks, all of those things that we needed, again, overnight. We've also started a pledge to text and census ambassador campaigns, which folks can pledge to take the census, and then they can also be included and become a census ambassador for their community and get a little digital sticker saying that they're a census ambassador. We've also moved to digital trainings for grantees, and also are upping our peer-to-peer texting and phone banking. And then some of our partners have done some really creative things. So OPAL, for example, Ohio Progressive Asian Women's L. I'm not sure what the L stands for. Sorry, OPAL.
Leadership.
Thank you, Women's Leadership. Appreciate you, Devante. Really engaged in some creative solutions like storytellings, and they did an Eat With Me program. And so folks would order, particularly when the anti-Asian racism was big around COVID, they would get folks together, order food from Asian restaurants, and just have a kind of dinner together. And the census would be one of the topics that they brought up. So if you're interested in getting involved with the OCAC, our website is ohiocensus.org. You can check there, or you can email Catherine Ungar, who's going to be the person in this role as I transition out, and we'll get you connected. Thanks, and I'll pass it over to Devante.
Perfect. First and foremost, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, the Center for Community Solutions for also inviting me on behalf of Cleveland Votes to talk about, some of our efforts with our partners here throughout Cleveland. Next slide, please. So right before we delve into some of the case studies and bodies of work of our amazing partners, I just want to, take some time to provide background about Cleveland Votes. We are a four-person team. As we love to say, we are small and extremely mighty. And it consists of Erica Anthony and Chris DuBryant, who are the co-founders of Cleveland Votes, my amazing colleague, Jennifer Lumpkin, who is the Civic Strategy Engagement Manager, and then, of course, myself. Thank you. So Cleveland Votes is a nonpartisan democracy building and mobilization initiative that aims to strengthen civic muscle and power to ensure that we have a more informed, participatory, and cohesive community. As we love to say, we're always emphasizing nonpartisanship, And we're always emphasizing and supporting our partners to find ways to embed nonpartisanship, democracy building efforts, and equity in all that they do. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So throughout our body of work here in Cleveland Votes, we are always elevating a term that we in fact borrowed from the Ohio State University's Kirwan Institute, which is the term equitable civic engagement. And we always begin each and every one of our engagements with this quote to be the foundation of everything that we do. And the quote reads as follows: fundamentally, equitable civic engagement is about leveraging the power dynamics of a place, giving voice to those previously alienated and excluded from the civic process. So in other words, what does it look like? What does it look like for us to, practice civic engagement each and every day, the moment we wake up to the moment that we go to sleep, and also saying, hey, we don't need to be civically engaged just when the census is here, or just when there's a general election or a primary election, but making sure that we are normalizing this as an everyday practice. Next slide, thank you. So on the screen, you will see 6 of Cleveland Votes areas of concentration. For the sake of this conversation and engagement, I will want to emphasize point number 5, which is Cleveland Votes. We serve as the chair for 2 complete count committees for both the city and the county. And then, as Aaron also previously mentioned, we're also the regional leads for our affiliation, in the Ohio Census Advocacy Coalition. So now let's discuss, figuring out the ways in which our partners are continuing to activate communities to complete the census. Thank you. So before we get started, I want to just elevate a body of work that we did prior to the census last year that was quite seamless in our affiliation with OCAC. So Cleveland Votes took the time to realize, and I appreciate that Tracy emphasized the act of being seen and heard. And once again, making sure that we are having the census come alive. There's so much content and so much data related to the census, and there's always this overarching, superordinate, call to action, which is to complete the census. But what happens when you are engaging with those hard to count individuals residing in those hard to count populations? And so with that said, the team and I, as well as our partnership with Jacinda Walker at Design Explorer, as well as our CCC members, all decided to take some time to just say, hey, let's stop for a second. And let's figure out what are the things that people in these communities see, do, hear, what do they feel? And making sure we are elevating that humanistic element in this body of work, making sure that they're truly being seen and do not feel unheard or feel invisible. And would you mind transitioning twice, please? Thank you so much. And so on the screen, you will see 2 of about 19 personas/infographics that we created in partnership with our CCC members. And on the screen, you'll see that there are about 4 numbers that highlights, and I appreciate Tracy mentioning this, like the very universal necessities that we all use. We all engage with education. We all engage with the healthcare. We all engage with food or the accessibility to healthy food, as well as streets and roads. So, but what happens when you take the time to say, hey, you live in the Huff neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, and this is the current status of your city, of your neighborhood pertaining to these 4 factors. Did you know that if you, your family, and friends complete the census, that is more resources and dollars that will be invested into your community to improve the state of your neighborhood and the state of your home. All in all, making sure that we are utilizing these infographics and these infographics to align with the appropriate data and making sure that the issues that are most palpable to those hard to count populations aligns with the overarching call to action, which of course is to complete the census. So all in all, making sure the census is truly coming alive for those individuals. Next slide, please. Thank you. 2 more transitions. Thank you. And so on the screen, you'll see two of our amazing partners, Union Miles Development Corporation, as well as the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, elevating, the census. They're utilizing the infographics, particularly of the zip code in which they provide services to, making sure that the people that they serve in that particular zip code see and knows the current status of their neighborhood. You also see, thank you so much, Erica. You also see information regarding the amount of funding that we could potentially lose due to the current status of our response rate. You will see that it was projected to be about $348 million per year due to the current 47% response rate where we stand in Cleveland, Ohio. And then lastly, the League of Women Voters also shared the current response rate for the state of Ohio and also Cleveland, Ohio. And I do want to emphasize the percentages is of course for June 25th versus today, which stands at 47%. But we're also practicing ways to make digital campaigns around the census engaging by incorporating QR codes in our signatures and incorporating QR codes in our graphics, once again directing people to mycensus2020.gov. That way they can simply point their cell phone cameras to the screen, a bit.ly link will appear on the top of your phone, and then you click on it and it will directly take you to the census website. Next slide, please. So very quickly, you'll see also some additional examples of our partners' amazing work elevating the census, as well as voting, because hence the name Cleveland Votes. It would be remiss not to find a synergy between equitable civic engagement, census, as well as voting. So on the top left, let me go back one more time. So on the top left, you'll see a partnership with the Black-owned business, making sure, and Third Space Action Lab, elevating the census. On the top right was a partnership with, or an event with Detroit Shoreway Community Development Corporation, elevating the census, as well as doing, as Aaron mentioned, free meal distribution. And they were also providing, through another partnership with Cleveland Votes, through an initiative called Mask for Communities, providing free PPE, so a free washable face mask, as well as information on behalf of Cleveland Votes to complete the census, as well as to check and as well as update your voter registration, as well as a bus to on behalf of Famicos Foundation to go around their community and to support people to complete the census. And then apologies for the video not being shown, but it was another partnership with Cleveland Votes, Third Space Action Lab, Black-owned catering service, as well as the Cleveland NAACP Cleveland branch that talked about, that had a a vote by mail drive-through initiative, in which we had individuals literally park into a church parking lot, and we provided them a free face mask, as well as information to complete your vote by mail application, as well as a free breakfast. And so you can, of course, incorporate and emulate that same strategy. Of course, another set of initiatives that we are doing, once again, in partnership with OCAC, is a text to pledge campaign. Once again, encouraging each and every person to make voting interactive, to make it fun. We all have cell phones, or many of us have cell phones, so why not use it as a way to become a census ambassador? You see the QR code on the top right, once again, using your cell phone to direct people to complete the census. And then the bottom right is a picture as a picture of our partnership with Mask for Communities, once again, elevating the census in voting. So lastly, what are some very clear ways for you to plug in? They're simple. One, we always encourage people to join us in our efforts to join the movement by signing up for our newsletters. Number two, I think this is the reason why we're all convening today, which is to complete the census, to encourage your family, friends, constituents, the people that you are serving to complete the census. And we even took the liberty of having the QR code that will directly take you to mycensus2020.gov on the screen. Of course, so many people are asking, how can we plug in and get involved? We always encourage people to reach out to us, Cleveland Votes, to serve as a volunteer, and we can definitely plug you into existing efforts. And then lastly, you know, if you want to assist us to assemble more of these kits that contains voting information, that contains census information, by all means, visit the site that the site that is on the screen as well. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you. And then very lastly, you know, once again, by all means, please feel free to reach out to Cleveland Votes. My amazing, you know, partners in crime include Erica Anthony, Crystal Bryan, Jennifer Lumpkin, and myself. And lastly, by all means, please feel free to check us out, join our movement, check out our work as we continue to elevate equitable civic engagement, census, and voting. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Devonta, and everyone who presented today, and thank you again to everyone who has attended our webinar. You can see the slides will be available, and a recording of today's webinar will also be available at that website address. It's also in the chat box, and I did want to remind everyone, if you have a question about anything any of our presenters have talked about, please enter it into the chat box, and we will try to answer as many as we can in the last about 10 minutes. So first question is for Tracy, but other participants, please feel free to answer. You mentioned that folks don't have to be a citizen in order to be counted, in order to fill out the census. Explain why that's not the goal, and if there are any suggestions you or any of our other presenters have to make people who aren't citizens feel more comfortable filling that out.
Sure, and according to the U.S. Constitution, the census is a count of all people living in this country, regardless. So the rationale for that, or you know, the rules for that, are found within our founding document for this country. Now, of course, there is a disconnect between what the Constitution says and also, you know, what the perceptions are out there amongst individuals who feel you know, a certain level of fear in being seen officially, you know, on these types of documents. And I think a lot of that is rooted in, you know, just the basic history of our country. You know, when you think about like, you know, Japanese internment and, you know, how that's the biggest example we have out there of how, you know, this data that should be protected for 72 years has been misused. So yes, fear is real and fear exists. And currently in kind of the environment that we're living in, that is very anti-immigrant, you know, in terms of, you know, certain political movements, you know, it I think exacerbates that, and it really makes it all the more real, especially when you include things like public charge, you know, the rule that the current administration tried to enact, forcing college students home who are going to be learning online, or international students who are living in the U.S. taking courses online. Thankfully, that was rescinded. I think the best thing that we can do as, you know, a community, as advocates, is to really hold firm on, you know, any kinds of protections of that data, and also push against any kind of actions that would try to in some way compromise the confidentiality of that data. That's just one example, but I mean, I feel it. You know, I'm Mexican American, you know, my family's been in this country since before Texas was a state, and you know, the fear is real regardless. But I think that we need to fight fear with facts. And I know that's not a great answer, but you know, we need to be counted, and we need to show that we're here.
Great. Next question for Kate. Kate, you mentioned that with the delayed census timeline, that there is going to be a crunch for redrawing those legislative districts here in Ohio. And you mentioned some state deadlines. Is there any chance that some of those state deadlines might be changed or extended? Since you said, you know, this isn't something that we should do lightly and do in a really short period of time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my understanding, and if anyone else knows something different, feel free to chime in. My understanding is that the state legislature could change those deadlines, but they would have to take separate action. So it's sort of separate from requesting congressional approval of these new deadlines for the redistricting data, that the state would have to also take some action to extend those deadlines. One thing that I know that some advocates have been hoping for is that the federal government will release those redistricting data sort of on a rolling basis instead of waiting until the end of July to release that data, that they would release the data sort of as it becomes available and prioritize states that have earlier redistricting deadlines to give them longer to work with the data.
Great. The next question was asked during Erin's presentation, but again, other presenters feel free to chime in. Are there specific examples of how faith groups are involved? And do you see a relationship between the role of faith groups and the communities that are above average, I assume, response rate?
Yeah, so in Ohio, Faith in Public Life has been a major partner with us. And so they've participated by integrating the census actually into their services for different faith groups, as well as participating in like weeks of action for their groups. I don't know if we've exactly been able to correlate, large faith-based populations with census taking. I just don't know, the overlap on that data, but it would be interesting to know that for sure.
Great. And Devante, you mentioned a lot about volunteering. What if someone does want to volunteer, but they're afraid of what they can and can't do because we are in the middle of the pandemic?
Absolutely. And once again, as we always say, there are multiple ways to plug into this work. You can, first and foremost, become a census ambassador, participate in our, OCAC text to pledge campaign. If you want to share additional content that is on each of our respective platforms, by all means, continue to do that to elevate the importance of the census. Because once again, to your point, Danny, we have to acknowledge that we are in a pandemic. So individual safety is always at the forefront. But all in all, if you do not perhaps want to be physically involved, there are definitely ways for you to be digitally involved.
Great. And since you mentioned that, Devante, we had one question about how does pledge to text work? Do you text your friends or are you given people to text?
Yes. So if on the screen, you will see, if you check out the Cleveland Votes website or go to the OCAC's website, you will see the text to pledge information. It's literally, and Erin, Tracy, please remind me the number because I always forget it. Because I cannot remember phone numbers. But if you text pledge or text a number to pledge, you could definitely get involved and then start to share it with your family and friends. Yeah, and just to follow up on that, and I'm looking up the number as well because I can't remember it, and in fact gave out the wrong number to our whole group merely a week ago. So I'll get that in a second and get back to you. But basically the pledge to text works. It's an individual texting service. So what you want to do is send that number out to friends, family, people you know, clients, whoever. And if they text the words pledge or censo, because it is available in Spanish, that will get sent along and you'll be signed up for census reminders and also given the chance to be a census ambassador. Our regional partners are also engaging in peer-to-peer texting campaigns. So if you have a regional partner who you know, like Cleveland Votes, there will be phone banking and peer-to-peer texting efforts in all those regional groups too. And they're listed on the OCAC website, or we can connect you with those. And Devante, thank you for putting the number in there. It's 614-295-9592. And we have materials too, if folks want that. We can send those out with the PowerPoint. So you can use those social media pics.
And that chat number is in the, the phone number is in the chat box as well for everyone.
Yes.
So another question that we had, are there any efforts specific to the southeastern part of the state or the Appalachia area?
Yeah, so one of our partners, the Ohio Mayor's Alliance, is working with some folks in Southeast Ohio. They just had a conglomeration of 3 organizations band together and get an ad campaign going. I think it's been challenging to figure out exactly how to get the word out because of the lack of internet access down there. So I think there's been some TV ads. I think they were looking into radio ads. But there is a specialized grant just for that area that 3 organizations are working on together to get the word out in Appalachian counties.
Great. And then another person asked, where can she obtain the response rate for older adults, and are there organized strategies for that population?
So I can not answer that question. The answer is that the response rates are not available broken down by demographics because we don't have the actual data. We just have the number of responses in any given area. So unfortunately, we don't have a clear answer to that, but I do know that generally speaking, response rates are higher among older adults than other segments of the population, just like we see with voter engagement and things like that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't barriers, especially with the pandemic. Those older adults might be more isolated than they normally are. And so I think senior centers and community centers hopefully that's something that's on their radar as they are reaching out to older adults and making sure that they've participated in the census. I know also having that phone line available to respond to the census is really important for older adults. So the fact that you don't have to necessarily go online, you can do a paper form, or if you need assistance, you can call that phone line that is on your census invitation.
Great, we're coming up, we're right at 2 o'clock, but the last question that we had, was there any thought about the 3 regional groups trying to partner with the Breast and Cervical Cancer Project to promote completion of the census as they have a reach in rural areas? It seemed to kind of go along with our previous question.
Yeah, so I think any group that wants to be involved in the census efforts can certainly sign up for OCAC. That's available to everyone, whether you're a partner or not.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We do have another webinar next Friday. Kelsey, what's the topic again? Kelsey's one of the organizers for it.
Yes. So we will be talking to our friends at the Ohio Association of Community Health Centers. So they'll be talking about their experience with making sure they're providing quality services, especially for underinsured or uninsured Ohioans across the state. They've also been performing a good amount of testing. So they'll be giving us their take on how they plan to continue operating and provide services for folks, as well as how testing is going in their center. So make sure you sign up for that webinar. I think the link will be live soon. Yeah, Danny?
So thank you again. And the slides should be available now on our website at that link. And a recording of the webinar will also be available later today. And thank you again to everyone for participating today and for watching our webinar. Have a nice Friday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.